U.S. President Donald Trump says he has struck his biggest trade deal yet, and he's agreed to a trade framework with the European Union.
We've reached a deal. It's a good deal for everybody, I believe.
The United States and the European Union have agreed to a new trade framework. At the center of it, a 15% blanket tariff on most European goods entering the U.S. Pharmaceuticals are exempt. But steel and aluminum from the EU will still face the steep 50% tariff imposed under national security provisions. In exchange, the EU committed to $750 billion worth of energy purchases from the United States and pledged $600 billion in new investments. They also agreed to significant defense procurement, although no figures were disclosed. This deal is not a binding treaty. It's a framework announced just days before a 30% tariff was set to take effect. That timing wasn't accidental. It followed the same pattern we've seen in other Trump-era negotiations. Pressure, then deal.
$750 billion worth of energy. To agree to invest into the United States $600 billion.
It's 15% tariffs across the board, all inclusive. The investments Mr. President just described, and the purchases over there. Indeed, basically the European market is open. It's 450 million people.
This isn't a one-off. We've already seen similar structures in deals with Japan, the United Kingdom, and Vietnam. In each case, Trump threatened steep tariffs. Then after days or weeks of speculation, a framework was announced, usually built around a 15% baseline tariff and large-scale investment or procurement from the foreign side. This model flips the trade conversation. It's not about removing barriers. It's about creating predictability and charging for it. Trump's 15% now feels moderate simply because the alternative he threatens is always worse. That's not trade liberalization. It's transactional stability, and the pattern is clear. Allies, competitors, everyone pays. Now all eyes turn to Canada. A 35% tariff is scheduled to take effect on August 1st if no deal is reached. Ottawa has made it clear the deadline is political, not legal, and they won't be rushed into a bad agreement. But the EU and Japan were longtime U.S. allies too, and both had to accept Trump's terms. Canada knows that, and while it hasn't signed any framework, it's not sitting idle. Canada brings leverage to the table. Over $1 trillion in investment into the U.S., a deeply integrated energy and auto supply chain, and decades of cross-border ties with key American states, Alberta's oil, Ontario's parts plants. These aren't abstract advantages, they're real points of influence. Carney's government is watching the sequence, not resisting it. The strategy isn't to be first, it's to be smart. The federal government has already moved to manage public expectations. Early promises of a good deal have shifted into a more realistic message. This will be about managing trade-offs. The lessons are clear. No country has secured full exemptions. Baseline tariffs are now the floor, and rushing into a vague framework like what Japan and the EU accepted might avoid pain in the short term, but lead to problems later. Instead, Ottawa is preparing, working with provinces, identifying sectors that need shielding, and exploring room for targeted offsets. Trade diplomacy is still happening, just not on Trump's schedule. Trump's trade system isn't built on trust. It's built on leverage and price tags. But that doesn't mean Canada has to fold. It means Canada has to shape a deal that protects what matters most, whether that's auto, energy, or digital trade. The real danger isn't delay. It's giving in too early for too little. In this new world, the countries that hesitate might get hit. But the countries that rush, they might get locked into terms they regret. And Carney knows better to sign the right deal late than the wrong deal too soon.
We're working very diligently with Europe, the EU, which covers a lot of territory, a lot of countries. But we haven't really, we don't have a deal with Canada. We haven't been focused on it.
Just days before his self-imposed August 1st deadline, President Donald Trump said it out loud. The U.S. hasn't really been focused on Canada and might not even reach a trade deal. It wasn't just a shrug, it was a statement of disregard. In the middle of high-stakes negotiations, Trump dismissed America's largest trading partner as an afterthought. He hinted Canada could simply pay the tariffs with no real negotiation. To many in Ottawa, this wasn't a threat, it was a signal. Because unlike his approach with Japan or the UK, where pressure was carefully escalated, this moment revealed something else: impatience. And that impatience may have just handed Canada a strategic edge.
Yeah, and the first thing everyone needs to do is exhale, because what the president just said there actually lines up very consistently with what we heard from Canada's negotiators on this.
For weeks, the Canadian government has worked to manage public expectations. Prime Minister Mark Carney, Minister Dominic LeBlanc, and Ambassador Kirsten Hillman have all echoed one message: Canada won't rush into a bad deal. Trump's public remarks ended up confirming that very narrative. When the U.S. president openly admitted a deal may not happen, he gave Canada cover. Now if talks break down, Ottawa won't take the blame because Washington walked away first. It's a rare case where silence from Canada was matched by a loud concession from the other side. For Ottawa, that's a communications victory even without a signed agreement. Trump's comments also put his own trade team in a difficult position. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer have been actively engaging with Canada, describing talks as constructive and productive. LeBlanc has spent days in Washington meeting with senators and senior officials. Yet, as his own officials were making progress, Trump sent a different message to the world. Negotiations might not matter at all. This internal contradiction weakens the American position. It allows Canadian officials to question who holds the real authority and to slow-walk discussions until a coherent U.S. stance emerges. The more fractured the American message, the more leverage Canada gains. But perhaps the biggest consequence of Trump's remarks won't be felt this week. It'll come in 2026. Under the terms of the USMCA, the agreement must undergo a mandatory review that begins with a Free Trade Commission meeting expected by late 2025. Trump's team has already signaled plans to use that review to push for stricter origin rules, immigration clauses, and supply chain controls. However, if the U.S. imposes 35% tariffs on Canada now without achieving a negotiated outcome, that strategy may backfire. Canada and Mexico will be able to argue that tariffs have already failed as leverage. Worse, Trump may find himself entering the 2026 review with less credibility and fewer tools. Meanwhile, Canada is preparing its own parallel track, a proposed security and economic agreement to solidify its defense commitments and regional cooperation. That deal, still in early stages, could give Ottawa a new foundation for talks and weaken Trump's ability to dominate the agenda. What looked like a warning may actually be a leak. Trump likely believed he was turning up the pressure. But by speaking too soon and undercutting his own negotiators, he exposed the cracks in his trade strategy. He gave Canada a narrative it can control, a pace it can set, and a reason to delay until the balance shifts. There's still time for a deal, but if there isn't one, it won't just be Canada that pays the price. Trump's own credibility heading into 2026 may be what gets taxed next.
Now, the Prime Minister has already stated that Canada won't accept a, quote, bad deal, even though concessions and border measures taken so far up. And Canadian counter tariffs are still on the table.
But I would look to see something Arctic specific in the budget. We might want to look at some of our first major projects being done in the Arctic.
While the world watches Washington's flurry of trade deals, something quieter, but potentially more lasting, is happening in Canada. As Trump courts new partners in Asia, Canada is turning to the Arctic, building economic resilience and forging powerful alliances with Indigenous communities. It's not just a policy shift, it's a strategic reset. Let's take a closer look at how Trump sidelined Canada and how Canada is pushing back. Since returning to office, President Trump has pursued a transactional approach to global trade. In July alone, his administration has announced new deals or frameworks with Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom. These agreements are fast, headline-friendly, and focused on slashing tariffs, sometimes down to 10 or 15%. But Canada isn't part of that club. Despite being America's largest export market and closest neighbor, Canada has been left out. Trump's logic: Canada already has a deal. CUSMA, formerly known as USMCA. According to U.S. officials, that agreement includes carve-outs, so Canada shouldn't expect further concessions. In fact, the opposite is happening. On March 4th, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods, and by June, steel and aluminum tariffs were raised to 50%. Now, he's threatening a sweeping 35% tariff by August 1st, unless Canada agrees to more U.S. market access. Washington calls it a reciprocal tariff, but to many in Ottawa, it feels like targeted punishment.
And what a great place. It has economic development potential, but there's defense importance, strategic defense, Arctic bases, other dual-use potential projects to roll out, and it sounds like willing partners potentially all around.
While Canada has responded with counter tariffs, reindustrialization, and a quiet consumer boycott of American goods, its most strategic move may be the one few are talking about. Canada is opening a new front, the Arctic. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has launched a sweeping northern strategy centered on Indigenous partnership, sovereignty, and strategic infrastructure. In July, Parliament passed Bill C-5 to fast-track development in Inuit regions. What makes this unique isn't just the scale of the investment, it's who's leading it. Canada has appointed an Arctic ambassador from the Inuit community. It has opened new consulates in Anchorage and Greenland and pledged over $6 billion Canadian dollars for radar systems, transport corridors, and northern energy projects. These initiatives are being developed with direct leadership from Inuit organizations, building both trust and long-term capacity. But this isn't just a domestic agenda, it's a strategic signal to Washington. By investing heavily in the Arctic, Canada is positioning itself as the democratic anchor in a region where Russia is militarizing and China is actively expanding influence. At the same time, it's quietly challenging America's assumption of uncontested dominance in North American defense. And this goes far beyond geopolitics. The Arctic holds vast reserves of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, the raw materials essential for electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and modern weapon systems. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, as of 2024, the United States still sourced over 90% of its rare earth imports from China. Canada's new approach, working directly with Inuit communities under constitutionally protected agreements, means control over these resources won't be dictated by external pressure. Any future U.S. access to Arctic supply chains will require trust, cooperation, and respect for indigenous governance. If Trump believed tariffs were the only leverage, he may have miscalculated. While the White House focuses on short-term wins, Canada is securing long-term power in territory, in resources, and in its relationships. And if Washington doesn't recalibrate, it risks being locked out of both Arctic diplomacy and the mineral supply chains it desperately needs. Trump may have assumed Canada had no other options, that it would wait in line for a new deal. But Canada is writing its own script. While some countries are chasing U.S. approval, Canada is building internal strength, defending its industries, rebalancing trade, and forming deep alliances with its own people.